This is the story of Boston Corbett, the man who killed John Wilkes Booth and lost his mind. And I know what you're thinking. Of course this guy was insane, his parents named him Boston. But in fact, he was born Thomas Corbett in London, England in 1832. 8 years later, his family immigrated to the United States, ultimately settling down in the city of Troy, New York. As a teenager, Corbett took up a job as a milliner, which is just someone who makes hats. These days you would probably call that a hatter or a Bangladesh sweatshop worker, but back then he was a milliner. And being a milliner in the 1840s meant working with the chemical compound mercury 2 nitrate, which was used to treat fur. Excessive exposure to mercury 2 nitrate can cause psychosis, so just keep that in mind when you hear about the stuff he does later in this video. In the 1850s, he moved to New York City and married a woman named Susan Rebecca, who was 13 years older than him. And adjusting for lifespan inflation, that's like a 40-year age gap today. But they were very happy together and decided to settle down in the South, which was an odd choice because Corbett was strongly opposed to the existence of slavery. And if you didn't want to work with companies that used slavery in the 1850s South, you weren't going to work with anyone. So the couple struggled to get by, and in 1856 decided to return to New York. Unfortunately, while they were on a ship to New York, Corbett's cradle-snatcher wife Susan fell ill and died. Devastated by the loss, Corbett moved to Boston, where he became a despondent alcoholic. Although, to be fair, that happens to everyone who moves to Boston. Unable to hold a job, he soon became homeless. For a while, it seemed that this was where his story would end. Until one night in 1857, when Corbett was on a bender and ran into a group of Methodists. And these were some temperance Methodists who looked down on drinking, so they did the logical thing and detained this drunk man until he was sober. In the process of sobering up, Corbett apparently experienced a religious epiphany which changed his life forever. From then on, he was a deeply religious man, spreading the gospel as a street preacher and becoming known as a local religious zealot. Little did anyone know that he was not even halfway to maximum zeal. By 1858, he had turned his life around thanks to religion, but there was one temptation he still couldn't control. Although he tried his best to be chaste, Corbett was just too damn horny. But like his other problems, he found his answer in the Bible. Specifically, Matthew 5:29, which reads, "And if thy right eye causeth thee to stumble, pluck it out, and cast it from thee. For it is profitable for thee that one of thy members should perish, and not thy whole body be cast into hell." And if you're interpreting that verse the same way he did, the solution was clear. Thomas Corbett would have to castrate himself. So on July 16th, 1858, armed with a pair of scissors, he did just that. And it was such a normal day to Corbett that he even ate a meal and went to a prayer meeting after committing the deed, before deciding that he should probably seek medical attention. After spending a month in the hospital, he emerged a new man, ready to serve the Lord without any temptations in his way. A friend later reported that Corbett was, quote, gratified with the result, as his passion was not trouble anymore. As part of his rebirth, he was baptized and changed his name from Thomas to Boston, since it was the city of Boston in which he found religion. Boston Corbett then grew out his hair to look like Jesus, working as both a preacher and a milliner for a few years. But when the Civil War broke out in 1861, Corbett was quick to enlist in the Union Army. And if you're thinking that this guy would make a terrible soldier, you'd be right. Well, to be honest, he wasn't exactly bad at being a soldier, he was just bad at being a normal person. Corbett would always carry a Bible with him and would read passages out loud. And even though almost everyone in the army was Christian, that doesn't mean they wanted to hear 1 Corinthians 15:34 in the middle of the night. He would also chastise people who didn't follow the ways of God. One time he even yelled at his commander for using the Lord's name in vain. For this, Corbett was sent to confinement for several days, but he still refused to apologize. His behavior got so bad that he was eventually court-martialed and sentenced to death by shooting. And you know it's bad when you're so annoying that the army decides you should be shot. Thankfully, they realized they were probably overreacting, and he was eventually just discharged instead. But Boston Corbett was so determined to fight slavery that he re-enlisted that same month. But his time in the Union Army wasn't just hijinks at base camp. In June of 1864, his regiment was surrounded by the Confederate Army in Northern Virginia. While other men were captured or simply surrendered, Corbett took cover in a ditch and kept fighting until he was out of ammo. A rebel soldier almost shot him in the head, but was stopped by his commander, who respected Corbett's desire to defend himself. Good thing he didn't know about his desire to read the Book of Revelations when you were trying to eat breakfast in peace. The Confederates took Corbett to Andersonville Prison in Georgia. On the walk over there, a thirsty prisoner ran to a nearby stream in an attempt to get water and was shot by some soldiers. Boston Corbett ran over and gave the man some water from his canteen while the Confederates all threatened to shoot him. Another prisoner later described it as the bravest deed that I had seen during the war. And it was this bravery that got Boston Corbett promoted to sergeant when he was released 5 months later in a prisoner exchange. By now, it was almost 1865, which means we're getting to the thing he's most remembered for. Although you'd be forgiven for forgetting he even killed John Wilkes Booth if you're still hung up on the castration thing. After Lincoln was shot, John Wilkes Booth went on the run, prompting the U.S. government to offer a $100,000 reward to anyone who could bring him and his accomplices to justice. On April 24, 1865, Corbett's regiment was sent to capture Booth. 2 days later, they questioned a family who revealed that John Wilkes Booth and his accomplice David Harold were hiding in their barn. Corbett and several other soldiers surrounded the barn and ordered the men to come out, but they refused. So the soldiers said, "All right, let's just set the barn on fire." David Harold ran out of the burning barn and surrendered, but Booth was still in there yelling about how he would not be taken alive. By pure chance, he then walked over to the side of the barn that Corbett was standing at. Corbett could see Booth through the cracks in the wall and could swear that Booth was aiming a gun, so he shot the assassin in the back of the head and neck. This actually did not kill Booth immediately, instead completely paralyzing him. What followed was about 3 hours of everyone awkwardly waiting around for Booth to die. In the middle of this, Corbett even went to get the men breakfast, and they finished eating only to find that Booth was still alive. After a little more waiting, he finally died, and they were able to call it a day. Pretty much instantly, Boston Corbett became a national celebrity. He was questioned a bit for shooting a guy who was probably not actually planning to attack anyone, but nobody really cared since they all hated John Wilkes Booth. Distributing the reward money was a complete mess, since everyone involved in any capacity wanted a piece of it. When everything was settled, Corbett received less than $1,700, which is about $35,000 today. But considering his army salary was only $4,000 a year in today's money, he was probably pretty satisfied. Plus, he was a celebrity now, which meant he could charge money for public appearances. He toured the country as Lincoln's Avenger, giving weird, incoherent speeches that nobody enjoyed. Unfortunately, all of this fame also came with some haters. Corbett received so many death threats from Confederate supporters that he became intensely paranoid and would carry a gun with him at all times. He eventually settled in Kansas, and although he tried to return to being a milliner, he was still a bit too into the whole Methodist thing to hold down a job. In 1883, the government granted him a stipend of $7.50 a month as a thanks for killing John Wilkes Booth, which feels like such an embarrassingly low amount of money that it would have been less insulting to give him nothing. But he needed all the money he could get, because his sanity was only deteriorating. In 1885, he saw some boys playing baseball in a field near his house and waved his pistol at them. Not because they were trespassing, but because they were playing a sport on the Sabbath. What part of Shabbat Shalom do you kids not understand? He was arrested, but the case was dismissed, because at this point everyone just felt sorry for him. So much so that he was even given a job by the state government the following year, working as an assistant doorkeeper at the Kansas House of Representatives. Couldn't even make him head doorkeeper, but at least there was upward mobility. A month into the job, Corbett complained about being discriminated against, probably by the head doorkeeper, and so he pulled a revolver out and started pointing it at his co-workers. The whole building was evacuated, and Corbett was tackled by the police, at which point everyone realized this couldn't continue. So Boston Corbett was ruled insane and sent to an asylum. But that was still not the end of his story. Over a year later, in May of 1888, Corbett broke out of the asylum by stealing the pony of the superintendent's son. He rode that pony to the small town of Neodesha, Kansas, where he met up with some old friends who gave him money and a horse. He told them he was going to Mexico and rode off, which ended up being the last time that anyone saw Boston Corbett. And perhaps that's the best way for a story like his to end. Whether he made it to the border and became Baja California Corbett, or if he died a mile out of town and nobody ever found the body, it's safe to say that his death was as mysterious as his life. As for what we did know of him, I'll let this quote by his old milliner boss sum it up. He was a good man, for all of his faults were of the head and not of the heart. Not to mention one small fault of the penis. Now please consider subscribing, or I'll shoot you through a wall and eat breakfast while you die.